Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show. Guests on your podcast, should you or shouldn't you? Welcome to another episode of Podcast Done For You, the show where we give you all the information you need to get your podcast up and running. We've got lots of things to discuss in regards to this very important topic because there's podcasts just like this one that you're watching right now, where it's just me. There are podcasts where there are two people, sometimes there are co-hosts, and then there's the question of guests. And should you or shouldn't you is a really interesting question. And then how you do that, well, that's an even more interesting question to discuss. So just a reminder from the outset, of course, that if you want the answer to all of this, really simple, come talk to us. Book a meeting straight away, Podcast Done For You, because we get all this happening for you and you don't have to worry about any of it. And part of the reason we set up that service is part of the reason why we're going to have this discussion today about should you or shouldn't you have guests. So in that premise, firstly, what I want to say to you is the reason that you build a podcast, the reason that most people build a podcast for their business is to build their credibility. They want to be known, that's why you're watching, want to be known as the go-to person in your area of expertise. You want more eyeballs or people listening to you as possible. Now that means that the emphasis actually needs to be on you. So the question of should you or shouldn't you have a guest, it just depends firstly about a few things. I think every podcaster should establish an opportunity where the whole voice of the show is about you. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, and as I've discussed in previous episodes of the podcast, and the reason that I've established the Podcast Done For You service is that I think it's much easier to be the credible person if you're having a conversation with someone. It's why we offer an anchoring service where I literally anchor your podcast. And there are many examples of those if you want to check them out, where I'm leading the conversation with you. So you just show up as being the credible person on there. And when we have at least one episode, sometimes there's half a dozen or more, where it's just the two of us talking, the value is it's all about you. I'm simply leading a conversation to allow you to speak as freely as possible. Now, the reason that I think that that's important, particularly on the outset, is you want your audience to have an opportunity to get to know you, to understand your backstory, to understand some of your areas of expertise, to allow you to just give your opinion on certain key topics. Now, there are many podcasters out there, and that is the only thing that they do, that they never bring a guest on. It is not an absolute must that you bring a guest onto your podcast. But if you feel as though that is something you want, you have to question why. Now, if we're building on the premise that you want to be the credible go-to person, then having guests on your podcast need to help you stand out still. Now, there are two types of guests that you can have on your program. They can be complementary, so they could be peers or they could be someone else that has something that works alongside of whatever it is you do, so that is a way of you both discussing issues. Or it could be more of someone who's been a client or someone who has an issue that you potentially can resolve. Now, the challenge in both of those scenarios is you moving away from being the credible person and ending up being the interviewer. It is a difficult thing to do. It's why when you watch interview shows on television, that they're not trying to build their credibility. They're trying to interview the guests. There is a difference between the two roles. It is very hard to manage that balance between the two. Again, it's why having an anchor for the program really helps you if you want to bring guests onto the program. But if you're going to do it by yourself, you've just got to be very aware that you've got to tread that line between giving your opinion to people as the expert and asking the guest for some insights from their perspective as well. Now, I've heard of complaints from people who have guested on podcasts where the effort of the podcaster to do so much of that to be the credible person means that as the guest, they barely got a say at all, which you don't want to do. So it is a fine line that you need to tread between those two ideas. So I put it to you that a guest adds a huge amount of value to your podcast if you do it right. But the question is, have you got the facilities to be able to do it right? So there are other episodes of this where I talk about the ability to do interviews and some tips around that. So we won't go into that right now. But I would just say to you this, that keep in mind always that you are trying to be the credible person. You are the reason that you are doing the podcast. So make sure that the guest is going to enhance that. Now, one of the other key reasons why you have a guest on a program is because it enables you to open up each other's networks. So, for example, you might have another podcaster on your program. And the great value about that is they'll talk about it on their show, you talk about it on your show, and hopefully it exposes a much greater audience to both podcasts. So there's a huge value in that as well. But again, you want to make sure that you're both being credible as part of that process and that it's not just for the sake of it, because the audience won't be fooled if you're not adding value to them. And again, you don't want to then just appear to be promoting the other podcaster. You need to be able to stand up for yourself as well. So it is important to think about that. But again, the reason why you would have guests on a program is a really important one. In fact, there is one other type of podcast that we haven't alluded to, and I do a bunch of these as well, whereby, in fact, the person that we're trying to build or the brand that we're trying to build doesn't even appear on the show at all. In fact, we do interviews on their behalf. And so it's really talking to their areas, and they become a sponsor of the program, and they, of course, share it with their network, but they're not necessarily on the program itself either. So that is also an option for you to consider. And that's right for some businesses and not for all. It often depends on how you're using the podcast. The great thing about a podcast, and when you do bring guests on, is that their willingness to share it. Now, I've definitely explored that. And those of you that have watched my Biz Bites podcast, where I do just solely interview people on there, look, part of the reason for doing that is because those people will share it with their networks. Now, let's face it, if I met you for the first time today and I said, would you mind sharing with your network how wonderful I am? The chances of you doing that is zero. The chances of you doing that if you're a guest on my podcast are greatly increased because it's equally about you. But again, it's treading that fine line of credibility. So you want to make sure that someone's not just sharing with their network and it's really just all about them, and there's no reason for them to come back and listen to you and learn more from you as well. So it is, again, that fine line that you have to tread. So my answer to the initial question of why should you have, or whether you should have guests on your podcast or not, is an absolute yes, you should in the majority of cases. But be cautious about being credible. Now, does it mean you have to have guests on your podcast? Absolutely not. And we're doing that right now in this podcast. As I said to you, these podcasts are all about just me giving you information. And that is of huge value to your audience. It's why you're watching right now, and why I do hope that you will subscribe using the button below, and that you'll also share it with your network because you see the value that you're getting. But I'd have to say to you, whilst I'm doing this now, please understand that my background is in the media. My background is in broadcast journalism. My ability to be able to turn the camera on and deliver this is probably quite different to someone else who hasn't been practicing that skill set for 30 plus years as I have been. So I think being able to do a podcast completely on your own is about being able to handle the audience, being able to have a conversation with the people on the other end. It's not a webinar. It's not an instructional idea. It's a conversation. They're the podcasts that work best, and hopefully we're holding your attention because it is a conversation with you right now. But again, that is a lot harder to pull off on a consistent basis than potentially you think. So by all means, give it a crack, but you'll find that it is quite hard. You don't want to overly script things either. you don't overly script a conversation. Now I've thought about what I'm going to say today, but I don't have a bunch of notes sitting in front of me. I'm not reading a script. This is me having a conversation with you as I would do if we were talking directly face to face, be it electronically or in person. We would have this conversation. And that's part of the trick of getting that across, because your listeners are going to be more engaged if they feel like you are talking to them. So again, what you don't want with a guest is that you isolate yourself from the audience. You want to be asking questions and answering ideas that you think the audience are interested in. And again, making sure that you're doing that for yourself as credible, not just trying to solicit that from your guest. So again, we go back to the balance. It is the most important thing that I can say to you. You have to be credible. You have to tread that fine line and that balance. Now, if you go to a podcast where you decide not to have guests and you don't just want it to be you, as I said earlier, the options that some people have is they grab a co-host. Now, again, that is a difficult thing to do if that co-host is not there as a person to serve and make you the credible person. If you are equally fighting for who is going to be credible, that battle doesn't always win and end well. I've spoken to many podcasters where it's fallen apart because one person appears to dominate over the other, and it can be very difficult to get that voice in and to find that balance between the two. Even if you're from the same company, that is a difficult thing to pull off. And again, there is chemistry is one thing in being able to pull it off, but it's also about the conversation and being effective, particularly when it comes to a business podcast. If it's an entertainment-based podcast, we're talking a whole different thing. This is really about business podcasts. This is what I'm talking to you about. If you want a business podcast and you want to be credible, having a co-host can work, but you need to have a pretty strong relationship and a pretty strong idea of what you are trying to do and how you're trying to build each other up, and not just ask each other questions and forget that you are also the credible person. The other thing too is that make sure that you grab a person, if you're going to have a co-host or even someone that is doing what I offer as a service as an anchor, so they're just trying to feed the conversation, make sure they understand your audience, because it is super critical that the conversation you're having is going to be with your audience in mind. I was speaking to someone recently where they were looking to grab their child, their son, I believe in this particular case, to do the anchoring side of the podcast. Now, the problem was their ideal audience that they're aiming for is people in their 40s and 50s, and the son was in his 20s. Now, it's a life experience thing. It's being able to respond in a conversation with the ideas of what a person of that age is able to understand and wants to know about is important as a life cycle thing to understand. And you may not be able to do that if you're in your 20s, for example. But also there is a skill set in being able to do that. Now, again, I didn't put this podcast out just to sell myself. I wanted to give you information about the ins and outs of having guests on your podcast or not. But I would say this to you, that my background is in building audiences. I've worked in marketing and communications for over 30 years. I know what it means to understand an audience and how to speak to that audience. That is a skill set that someone, just because they're related to you or because they're a mate, doesn't mean they automatically know how to do that. Remember, more often than not, family, friends, and even colleagues are not your ideal clients. So you need to have someone that's got that skill set to be able to lead a conversation, make you the expert, and have the audience in mind. So hence the service podcast done for you, because we take care of all of that for you, make it as easy as possible. And we discuss with you, should you have guests? Maybe you should, maybe they shouldn't all be with guests. The great thing about having an anchor for the program means that that option is always open to you. We can do many variations and we can just make it happen. We do start this with many of our clients where we just sit down for a 2-hour conversation and we turn that into a whole bunch of episodes. It's very efficient, very effective. And what's more, you are the credible person on your own program, which at the end of the day is the real goal. We can bring guests on as we do with many of our podcasters, but I will always keep you in mind to make sure that not only am I leading the conversation to make sure it flows, but I'm including you and putting you up as the expert. That's the reason it exists. So I hope you got something out of this. I hope you understand the ins and outs of having guests on your program. And I hope that you will, again, subscribe, share this, and listen in to future episodes of Podcast Done For You, the show.